So, this whole thing started a few months ago. I thought everything was fine in my marriage. Like, we had our ups and downs, but nothing out of the ordinary, you know? But then one night I noticed Linda acting kinda off. She started spending more time at work, more late-night projects popping up all of a sudden. At first I didn't think much of it, but then the nagging feeling started to grow. Something wasn't right. I didn't want to be the guy who jumps to conclusions. But when her phone kept blowing up with notifications, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I asked her about it one night when we were sitting on the couch. I was trying to be calm, casual, like, "Hey, you seem busy with work lately. Everything okay?" Linda hesitated. Then she looked me dead in the eye and said, "John, we need to talk." Now, I've been married long enough to know that those words never lead anywhere good. My stomach dropped. I braced myself for whatever bomb she was about to drop, but nothing could have prepared me for what she said next. "I've been thinking about seeing someone else," she said, as if it was the most normal thing in the world. "What do you mean?" I asked, already feeling the sting of her words, but hoping she'd explain it differently. She sighed, like she was annoyed at me for even asking. "It's Frank. From work. I think I want to pursue something with him." I couldn't speak for a second. Frank, the guy she'd been mentioning more and more recently, the one who she always said was just a friend. I felt like the room was spinning. "You want to pursue something?" I repeated, trying to wrap my head around it. "Linda, you're married to me. We have a life together, a home. What the hell are you talking about?" "I love you, John. But this, with Frank, it's something I need to explore." She said it so calmly, like it was some kind of side project, not something that would rip my entire world apart. At that moment, I felt like I'd been sucker punched. My head was reeling, but instead of losing it, I just stared at her, stunned. I just sat there, silent, trying to keep my cool. My brain was on overdrive, but somehow I managed to ask, "So, what? You're just going to go have an affair with this guy while we're still married?" Linda had the nerve to look at me like I was overreacting. "It's not like that. I'm being honest with you. I don't want to sneak around or lie. I care about you, John. I really do. But I have feelings for Frank. I think I deserve to explore that." Deserve? That word hit me hard. What about what I deserve, Linda? What about what this'll do to us? She leaned back, crossing her arms, like she had it all figured out. "I'm not saying I want to leave you. I love you, but I need this. Frank and I have something. I don't know how to explain it. You wouldn't understand." I was floored. "Try me. Try to explain why the woman I love is telling me she's planning to cheat on me. But it's supposed to be okay because she's honest about it." She rolled her eyes. Rolled her eyes. "It's not cheating if I'm being upfront, John. It's an open conversation." "Open conversation?" I shot back, louder than I meant to. "That's what you're calling this? It's not an affair because you gave me a heads up?" Linda didn't even flinch. "If you want to look at it that way, fine. But I'm not going to stop myself from being happy just because you're too stuck in the past to understand." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This wasn't just about her screwing Frank. This was about her making herself the victim in all of this. Like I was the unreasonable one for not jumping on board with her twisted idea of exploring feelings. The next words I said surprised even me. "If you do this, Linda, if you go ahead with whatever this is, there will be consequences." She shrugged. "I'll take my chances." I didn't know what to do after that. I mean, what do you even say when your wife of 10 years casually tells you she's planning to sleep with someone else, but still loves you? I felt like I was living in some kind of twisted reality. After our talk, Linda just went upstairs like nothing had happened. Like she hadn't just shattered everything. Meanwhile, I sat there staring at the wall, trying to figure out what the hell I was supposed to do next. That night, I barely slept. My mind was spinning with everything she'd said. I couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't just thinking about it. She'd already made up her mind. I didn't want to believe it, but deep down I knew. The next morning, I did something I never thought I'd have to do. I started looking into options. I researched divorce lawyers. I looked up private investigators. I even started reading about hidden cameras just in case. Part of me felt dirty, like I was the one doing something wrong by planning ahead, but I knew I had to protect myself. If she was going to blow up our marriage, I wasn't going to let her walk away without consequences. A few days later, I decided to confront her again, hoping maybe she'd come to her senses. "Have you thought about what I said?" I asked over breakfast, trying to sound calm. Linda didn't even look up from her coffee. "Yeah, I have. And like I said, I'm going to do this, John. I already booked a weekend trip for me and Frank." That hit me like a ton of bricks. "You're serious?" I asked, my voice shaky. "You actually booked a trip?" She nodded, as if it was no big deal. "It's just a weekend away. We need time to figure things out." I felt a wave of anger and hurt crash over me. She wasn't just thinking about it anymore, she was doing it. "Linda, this is going to destroy everything. You realize that, right?" She finally looked at me, her eyes cold. "Maybe, but maybe not. Maybe we'll both get what we need out of this." I couldn't believe it. She wasn't backing down, and that's when I knew I had to take matters into my own hands. The minute Linda left for work, I got to work myself. I knew I had to act fast. She wasn't bluffing. She had already made her choice, and I wasn't about to sit around and let her walk all over me. First, I bought a few small cameras online, discreet ones that I could install without her noticing. I figured if she was going to do this, I'd need solid proof. Divorce courts can get messy, and I wasn't about to let her walk away with half of everything after betraying me like this. I also called a lawyer. I kept the conversation brief, but I made sure I knew my rights. He told me that gathering evidence was crucial if I wanted to make sure things went my way in the divorce. I felt like I was planning for war, but I didn't see any other choice. A few days passed and Linda didn't mention the trip again, but I knew it was coming. I overheard her on the phone with Frank, making plans, talking about getting away, and finally having some time together. My blood boiled every time I heard his name. The day before their trip, I decided to make my move. While Linda was out, I went to the hotel they'd booked and spoke to someone at the front desk. It took some smooth talking, but I managed to get access to the room they'd be staying in. I installed the cameras in places they wouldn't notice, inside a lamp, behind a TV, even in the closet. I made sure there wasn't a single angle they could hide from. Every moment would be recorded. But that wasn't all. I had one more trick up my sleeve. Linda had packed a few things in her suitcase earlier that day, including some new lingerie, stuff I'd never seen before, obviously meant for Frank. That's when I got the idea. I grabbed the bottle of pepper spray I kept in my nightstand and sprayed it inside the fabric of her lingerie. Not too much, just enough to make sure she'd feel it when she put it on. It was petty, I know, but I wasn't exactly in a forgiving mood. Everything was in place. Now I just had to wait and watch the fallout. The next day, Linda packed her bags, kissed me on the cheek like it was just another weekend, and left for her work trip. I watched her pull out of the driveway, my stomach churning, but I kept my cool. As soon as she was gone, I logged into the hotel's surveillance system from my phone. It felt surreal, like I was some kind of undercover detective spying on my own wife. But it was necessary. Hours later, I saw them arrive at the hotel through the camera by the front door. Linda looked happier than I'd seen her in weeks, practically glowing as she clung to Frank's arm. I couldn't believe she was doing this so openly, like there wasn't a husband sitting at home, watching everything. Frank was every bit the smug jerk I'd imagined, overconfident, laughing with her, acting like he didn't have a care in the world. They checked into the room, and that's when things got really real. I could see everything as they walked in. Linda setting her bags down, Frank wrapping his arms around her waist, kissing her like she was his, like I didn't even exist. My chest tightened with a mix of rage and heartbreak, but I stayed glued to the screen, determined to see this through. After a while, Linda started unpacking. That's when she pulled out the lingerie, the one I'd pepper sprayed. I leaned in closer, watching as she slipped into the bathroom to change. This was it. I waited, heart pounding, as she came out of the bathroom in her new outfit, smiling seductively at Frank. He was all over her instantly. like he'd been waiting for this moment forever. But then, the magic started to fade quickly. Linda stopped mid-step, her face twisting into confusion. She shifted uncomfortably, rubbing at her skin, and then it hit her. Her eyes went wide, and she started scratching at herself, trying to play it off, but you could tell something was very, very wrong. Frank looked confused at first, but then Linda started full-on panicking, running back into the bathroom, slamming the door behind her. I couldn't help it. A smirk crept across my face. "How's that for romance?" I muttered to myself. I watched as Frank knocked on the bathroom door, asking her if she was okay, but Linda didn't answer. The cameras couldn't catch her inside, but the muffled sounds of her cursing and rushing around gave me a pretty good idea of what was happening in there. She was freaking out. Frank, being the clueless idiot he was, sat on the bed, checking his phone while waiting for her to calm down. Meanwhile, I was practically glued to my screen, enjoying every second of it. But I wasn't done yet. I had a few more tricks up my sleeve to ruin their little love getaway. Right around the time Linda was probably still trying to wash off the pepper spray, I made a quick call and had flowers delivered to the hotel room. A big, over-the-top bouquet with a card that said, "Thinking of you both, John." The flowers arrived within the hour. I watched through the camera as Frank opened the door, his face twisting in confusion as he read the card. The delivery guy stood there awkwardly, waiting for a tip, while Frank just stared at the bouquet like it was a bomb about to go off. He must have thought Linda ordered them, but then he read the card. His expression went from puzzled to panicked in seconds. I could see him mouthing my name as he turned the card over again, probably trying to convince himself it was some sick joke. But there was no mistaking it. I wanted him to know exactly who was messing with him. Linda was still holed up in the bathroom, and Frank, looking like a complete idiot, stashed the flowers behind the bed like he could hide the evidence. He knocked on the bathroom door again, trying to sound calm. Babe? You okay in there?" She didn't answer right away, probably still dealing with the after effects of the pepper spray. I couldn't hear her, but I imagined her trying to scrub it off her skin. She finally came out, looking red and irritated, wrapped in a towel. She was scratching at her arms and legs, clearly miserable. Frank tried to play it cool. "Hey, some flowers just came. Weird, right? They're from your husband." He said it like he was testing the waters, trying to gauge her reaction. Linda froze, eyes wide. "What? John sent flowers?" She looked freaked out, like the realization was hitting her that I wasn't as clueless as she thought. "Yeah," Frank said, handing her the card. "I don't know what to make of it." She read the card, her hands shaking a bit, and I could see her mind racing. She probably thought I was sitting at home oblivious, but now she knew I was watching. I wasn't just going to let this slide. Frank looked uncomfortable, like he wasn't sure whether to be angry or scared. I sat back, watching them squirm, but I wasn't finished. Not yet. The pizza came next. I had ordered it earlier, extra large, 2 of them, with every ridiculous topping I could think of. I wanted it to be a total mess, something they'd never eat. As soon as the doorbell rang again, I saw Frank's face drop. He knew something was up. "Did you order pizza?" Linda asked, clearly still on edge. Frank shook his head, looking like he wanted to disappear. He opened the door, and the delivery guy handed him 2 massive pizzas. Frank fumbled for cash, looking completely thrown off his game. Linda was behind him, still scratching her skin, looking more annoyed by the second. "Who the hell sent this?" Frank mumbled as he grabbed the pizzas, obviously pissed now. There was another note, of course. "Enjoy your night, John." Linda looked at him, eyes narrowing. "You think he knows? You think John's been spying on us?" I could tell she was starting to panic. Frank, trying to calm her down, shrugged. "Maybe it's just some sick joke. I don't know, but we can't let it ruin the weekend." But it was too late. I could see the tension building, the cracks in their little fantasy starting to show. This wasn't the romantic getaway Linda had planned. She was itching literally and figuratively, and Frank had gone from smug to stressed out in a matter of hours. I sat back and smiled. This was just the beginning. after the pizza stunt, things really started to unravel between Linda and Frank. I watched them through the cameras as they sat on the edge of the bed, clearly not having the romantic night they'd imagined. Frank was picking at a slice of pizza, trying to act normal, but Linda wasn't having any of it. She kept scratching at her arms, her face twisted in frustration, completely distracted from whatever fantasy she'd had in mind. "I can't believe John would do this," she muttered, pacing around the room. "How does he even know we're here? This is insane." Frank tried to calm her down, but he looked like he was unraveling too. "Maybe he doesn't know. Maybe it's just some weird coincidence, you know? Flowers, pizza. It doesn't mean he's watching us." Linda shot him a look that said otherwise. She wasn't buying it, and honestly, neither was I. She knew I was always one step ahead. And now, that fact was gnawing at her. "Frank, this is bad," she hissed, throwing her hands up in frustration. "I told you we should have gone somewhere more private. John's probably sitting at home, laughing at us right now." I had to admit, she was right about that part. At that point, Linda grabbed her phone and tried calling me. I didn't pick up, of course. I wasn't about to give her the satisfaction of confronting me just yet. She left a voicemail, something along the lines of, "John, this isn't funny. What do you think you're doing? Call me back." Her voice was shaky, almost pleading. Frank, meanwhile, was getting more and more uncomfortable. I could see the fear in his eyes. He wasn't expecting this kind of blowback. He probably thought this affair would be all fun and games, but now, with me lurking in the background, the reality was sinking in. "I don't know, Linda," Frank said, rubbing the back of his neck. "Maybe we should just cut this short. I mean, this is getting weird." Linda wasn't having it. "No, we're not cutting anything short. This was supposed to be our time together, and I'm not letting him ruin it." She was fuming, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. Her anger only made me feel more satisfied. But I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. I had one final move left to play. Earlier in the day, I'd sent an anonymous message to Frank's wife. Yeah, that's right. He wasn't exactly single either. I'd found her on social media, sent her some screenshots of the hotel reservation with Frank's name on it, and attached a little message that said, "You should know where your husband is spending the weekend." I didn't know if she'd show up, but it was worth the gamble. Sure enough, about an hour later, just when things had started to settle down in the room, there was a knock at the door. Frank jumped up, looking nervous. "Who the hell is that?" he muttered, glancing at Linda, who was still sulking on the bed. He opened the door, and there she was, Frank's wife, standing there with a look that could kill. "What the hell is this, Frank?" she snapped, holding up her phone with the screenshots I'd sent her. "You think I wouldn't find out?" Linda froze, her face going pale. Frank looked like a deer in headlights. "Beth, I can explain," he stammered, stepping toward her. But Beth wasn't having any of it. "Explain? You're cheating on me in some cheap hotel room with this woman, and you think you can explain?" she shouted, her voice echoing through the room. Linda sat there, stunned, not saying a word. The tension was thick, and I could feel it even through the screen. Beth stormed into the room, throwing her phone on the bed where Linda was sitting. "Go ahead, explain, Frank. Explain this whole little setup you've got going on." She pointed at Linda. "And you're just as guilty." I couldn't hear much after that, but watching the chaos unfold was pure satisfaction. Frank was stumbling over his words, Linda was trying to hold it together, and Beth was tearing into both of them like a storm. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. The entire fantasy Linda had built around this affair was crumbling in real time, and she had nowhere to hide. And me? I was already one step ahead, preparing the final blow that would end it all. Watching Frank and Linda squirm as Beth tore into them was more satisfying than I could have imagined. Frank tried to calm his wife down, mumbling pathetic excuses, but Beth wasn't backing off. She threw a few things around the room, mostly Frank stuff, while Linda just sat there, shell-shocked. Linda's confident, smug attitude had completely vanished. She kept glancing at Frank, waiting for him to fix the situation, but he was as helpless as she was. For once, She was seeing what her affair really was: cheap, messy, and utterly falling apart. Meanwhile, I sat back and kept an eye on the camera feeds, knowing the best was still to come. I wasn't just collecting footage for my own satisfaction. No, this was about building my case. Everything they did, every argument, every touch, every look, was going to be used against her in court. And when I served her the divorce papers, it would all come crashing down. But Beth wasn't finished yet. She stormed right up to Linda, practically spitting with rage. "I hope you know what you've done," she hissed, glaring at her. "You think this was worth it? Ruining 2 marriages for a sleazy hotel affair." Linda finally found her voice, though it didn't help. "It's not what you think," she said weakly, clearly grasping for some kind of defense. Beth laughed bitterly. "Oh, it's exactly what I think. You're just mad because you got caught. I should have known Frank was messing around with someone like you." Linda didn't respond, just stared at the floor while Beth turned her attention back to Frank. "We're done. You better believe I'm getting a lawyer, and I'll take you for everything you've got." That was my cue. I picked up my phone, called a courier service, and arranged for Linda's divorce papers to be delivered the next morning, right to her office. I wanted her to see them when she least expected it, right in front of her coworkers. If she thought this weekend was a disaster, she had no idea what was coming. Back in the hotel room, Frank was still trying to salvage something. "Beth, please, let's talk about this at home," he pleaded, his voice shaking. "We don't have to do this here." Beth wasn't hearing any of it. "Oh, we're doing this right now," she snapped, grabbing her purse. "I'm not waiting another second to end this mess. Enjoy your little fling, Frank. It's the last one you'll have." And just like that, she stormed out, slamming the door behind her. Frank stood there in silence for a few moments, looking like he was trying to figure out what just happened. Linda finally got up from the bed, her face flushed with embarrassment. "What are we going to do now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Frank just shook his head, running his hands through his hair. "I don't know, Linda. This is a nightmare." I almost felt bad for them. Almost. They sat there for a while, both too shocked to move, and that's when I decided to twist the knife one last time. I sent Frank a text from an anonymous number, something simple. "Hope you're enjoying the weekend, Frank. John." I watched as he pulled out his phone, read the message, and then looked at Linda, his face going pale. He didn't say anything, just showed her the screen. She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "John knows everything," she whispered, panic creeping into her voice. Frank didn't say a word. He just stared at the phone, probably wondering how deep into this mess he'd gotten himself. Linda, on the other hand, looked like she was on the verge of tears. "He's been watching us, hasn't he? He's going to use this against me in court," she muttered, pacing back and forth. "Frank, I could lose everything." I almost laughed. She was just now realizing that. Too little, too late. They spent the rest of the night in silence, neither of them touching the pizza or the flowers. The romance was long gone. And me? I went to bed that night with a smile, knowing I'd set everything in motion. Tomorrow would be the day it all fell apart for Linda. The next morning came, and I was up early, sipping my coffee, waiting for the moment I knew was coming. The courier was already on his way to Linda's office with the divorce papers, and I had everything set. She was about to get the surprise of her life, and I couldn't wait to see how it all played out. Around 10 a.m., my phone buzzed with a notification. The cameras were still active in the hotel room, and I saw Linda and Frank waking up, looking like they'd both been hit by a truck. The fallout from the night before had left them drained. Frank was sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at his phone, probably wondering if his wife had already started packing up his things. Linda was in the bathroom, looking like she'd aged 10 years overnight. Her confidence was gone. She wasn't the smug, manipulative person who had told me she deserved to explore her feelings with Frank. Now, she was just a wreck, scratching at the remnants of that pepper spray I'd carefully left for her. I couldn't stop grinning. It wasn't long before I got another notification. The courier had arrived at Linda's office. I had requested a photo confirmation, And there it was, Linda's name on a large envelope marked confidential. The papers had been delivered right to her desk. I imagined her walking into work, still reeling from her ruined weekend, only to find her entire world flipped upside down. I didn't have to wait long for the fallout. A couple of hours later, Linda called me. This time I picked up. "John, what the hell is this?" she snapped, her voice shaking. "You sent me divorce papers? You can't be serious." I kept my voice calm, steady. "I warned you, Linda. I told you there'd be consequences. You can't just end our marriage like this," she shouted. "We haven't even talked about it." I laughed bitterly. "We talked, Linda. Remember? You said you wanted to pursue something with Frank. You didn't want to sneak around, so I gave you the honesty you asked for. Now I'm giving you your freedom." There was silence on the other end. I could almost hear her trying to come up with something, anything, to turn this around. "John, please," she finally said, her voice softer now, almost pleading. "It was a mistake. I didn't mean for it to go this far. Can we just talk about this?" I shook my head, even though she couldn't see it. "No, Linda. You made your choice. You can have Frank, but you can't have me. It's over. But I still love you," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Love?" I snapped, unable to keep the anger out of my voice now. "You call this love? Sneaking around with another man, lying to my face, booking a romantic getaway while I sit at home like a fool? No, Linda. Whatever this was, it wasn't love." There was a long pause before she spoke again, her voice desperate. "John, please don't do this. I'll stop seeing Frank. I'll do whatever it takes. Just don't leave me." For a brief moment, I could hear real fear in her voice. She wasn't in control anymore. She was the one begging, and I was the one holding the cards. It was a strange feeling, but I didn't let it sway me. "You should have thought about that before you destroyed everything we built," I said, my tone cold. "You wanted to see what life with Frank would be like. Now you can. But I'm done." Linda didn't say anything after that. I waited for her to hang up, but all I heard was her breathing, shaky and shallow. Finally, I ended the call myself. There was nothing left to say. I sat back, feeling a strange sense of peace. For the first time in weeks, the weight on my chest had lifted. Linda had made her bed, and now she would have to lie in it. But I wasn't finished with Frank yet. I had one more delivery scheduled for later that day, right to his office, just like I'd done with Linda. Inside was a copy of the footage I'd collected from the hotel room. It wasn't just for him, though. His boss was about to get a front row seat to Frank's little affair. One final nail in the coffin. The call with Linda left me feeling strangely calm. I didn't feel like I'd won or that I had come out on top, but I did feel free, like a huge weight had been lifted off me. But I knew the day wasn't over yet, and I still had one last part to play. Frank was next. After sending Linda the divorce papers, it was only fair that Frank got his own surprise. I had arranged for a package to be delivered to his office later that afternoon. Inside, as I mentioned, was a USB drive with the footage from their little getaway. But that wasn't the only recipient. His boss and the HR department were also going to get a special copy. You know, just in case Frank's work policies had any rules about conduct or morality. I wanted him to feel the same panic and humiliation that I'd been dealing with since I found out about the affair. Let him explain to his boss why he was in a hotel room with a married woman instead of, doing his actual job. I logged back into the camera feed, and as luck would have it, Frank was sitting on the bed, phone in hand, looking as anxious as ever. Linda had left the hotel room not long after our call. She must have been too rattled to stay there with him, probably realizing her weekend of exploring feelings had turned into a complete disaster. Frank, for his part, was doing damage control, probably texting or calling his wife. He looked like a man on the edge, pacing around the room, glancing at his phone every few seconds, probably waiting for the next bomb to drop. And it was about to. Right on cue, I got the notification that the package had been delivered to Frank's office. I watched him get a call a few minutes later, and I could practically see the panic in his eyes. His hands were shaking as he shoved his phone into his pocket, grabbed his coat, and stormed out of the hotel room. Showtime, I muttered to myself, leaning back in my chair. I knew exactly where Frank was headed, his office. He probably thought he could intercept the package before anyone else saw it. But by now, it was too late. HR would already have the footage, and Frank would be left scrambling for some excuse, some explanation. Meanwhile, Linda had gone radio silent. I assumed she was back at work, trying to process the fact that her entire life was crumbling around her. I didn't expect to hear from her for a while, but I knew she was probably drowning in regret. Her weekend with Frank had turned into a complete nightmare, and now she was facing the reality of losing everything. Me, her marriage, maybe even her job if the office gossip got wind of her affair. And Frank, he was about to lose a lot more than just his dignity. Hours later, I got an update from my lawyer. Linda had already reached out to him, panicking, begging to reconsider the divorce. She wanted to talk things through, apparently hoping we could settle this quietly, without a court battle. I knew what that meant. She was terrified of losing half of everything. But I wasn't in the mood to negotiate. Not after everything she'd done. I told my lawyer to proceed with the divorce, no settlements, no reconciliation. She made her choice when she walked into that hotel room with Frank. Now she'd have to live with it. As for Frank, I didn't hear much from him after that day. But through the grapevine, I found out his company had suspended him pending an internal review. Apparently, the footage from the hotel room didn't sit well with HR. They weren't too keen on their employees having affairs on company time, especially when it involved another coworker's spouse. Frank had gone from confident and smug to jobless and humiliated in a matter of hours. It was the perfect ending. By the next morning, I could feel the fallout settling in. Linda had gone quiet, no calls, no texts, not even an email. Frank, from what I could gather, he was lying low after being suspended from his job. I was curious if Beth, his wife, had already started packing up his stuff, or if he was stuck living in some cheap motel, trying to figure out where it all went wrong. But honestly, I wasn't really concerned about them anymore. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was finally moving forward. The divorce was rolling, my evidence was airtight, and both Linda and Frank were facing the consequences of their actions. Now, I just had to let everything play out. Later that day, I got a message from my lawyer again. Linda had officially agreed to meet up and discuss the terms of the divorce. I knew it was a desperate move on her part and she was likely hoping for some sort of compromise, but I wasn't interested in giving her a way out. She wanted Frank, she could have him, just without me or half of everything I'd worked for. We met at a neutral spot, one of those stuffy conference rooms in a lawyer's office. When I walked in, Linda was already there, sitting across from her lawyer looking broken. She wasn't the confident, arrogant woman who had boldly told me she was going to explore her feelings. No, now she just looked scared, beaten down by the mess she had created. Her lawyer nodded at me, and I took my seat across from them, feeling calm and collected. Linda couldn't even meet my eyes at first, and I could tell she was dreading this conversation. "John," she finally started, her voice soft and shaky. I don't even know what to say. This is all just, it's gone too far." I raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to continue. I wasn't about to make this easy for her. "I made a mistake," she said, her voice cracking a bit. "A huge mistake. I don't even know what I was thinking. I got caught up in something that I thought was going to make me happy, but it's destroyed everything." I leaned back in my chair, arms crossed, still waiting. I wasn't going to jump in and save her from this. She needed to say it all. "I never wanted to hurt you," she whispered, her eyes finally meeting mine. "I still love you, John. I don't know if you believe that, but I do. I never stopped loving you. I thought I could have both, but I was wrong." I stared at her, feeling a strange mix of anger and pity. How could she say she loved me after all of this? After lying, sneaking around, betraying me in the worst way possible? I cleared my throat. "You're right. You were wrong, Linda. You were wrong to think you could have both. You were wrong to think you could throw our marriage away for some fling and not pay the price. Tears welled up in her eyes, but I wasn't moved. John, please, she whispered. Can't we just try to fix this? I'll leave Frank. I swear I'll never see him again. I'll do whatever it takes. It was almost pathetic seeing her like this. The woman who thought she could control everything was now begging me to stay. I shook my head slowly. No, Linda. There's no fixing this. You made your choice, and now you have to live with it. We're done. Her face crumpled as the reality set in. There was no going back, no saving her from the consequences of her actions. We spent the rest of the meeting discussing the terms. I didn't make it easy for her. I wasn't going to give her a clean break after what she put me through. She would have to fight for every dollar, and there was no chance I was going to let her take what was mine. By the end, she looked exhausted, defeated. I never wanted this, she whispered again as I got up to leave. I didn't look back. You got what you wanted, Linda. Now live with it. I walked out of that room, leaving her to sit with the mess she'd made. It felt final, like the last page of a chapter one never wanted to write. But it was over now. The rest was just paperwork and formalities. And I had no regrets. After that meeting, I thought Linda might finally back off and accept that the marriage was over. But I should have known better. A few days later, I got a text from her. It was short but desperate. John, please. Can we talk? Just once more. I stared at the message for a while, debating whether or not to even respond. Part of me was tempted to hear what she had to say, but the other part of me knew she was only trying to claw her way out of the mess she'd made. I wasn't in the mood for any more of her excuses or her tears. Still, curiosity got the better of me, so I agreed to meet her. I wanted to see what else she could possibly say to try and fix the unfixable. We met at a small park just outside of town, neutral territory again. I wasn't about to let her back into the house, not after everything. When I arrived, she was already sitting on a bench, looking anxious and a bit worn out. She wasn't the polished, put-together woman she'd been before all this. Now, she just looked tired, emotionally drained. As I approached, she stood up, fiddling nervously with her hands. Thanks for coming, she said quietly, her voice soft. I didn't say anything, just nodded and sat down on the bench. I wanted her to get to the point. She sat next to me, not too close, but enough that I could feel the tension between us. John, I know I've said it before, but I'm sorry, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I know sorry doesn't fix what I did, but I need you to understand. I was lost. I got caught up in something I thought would make me feel alive again, but all it did was destroy everything. I stared out at the park, listening, but not really feeling anything. She could apologize all she wanted, but it wasn't going to change the facts. She'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. You don't get it, do you? I said finally, turning to look at her. You didn't just destroy our marriage, Linda. You destroyed me. You took everything we built together and burned it to the ground because you wanted something different, something you thought would make you happy. But in the end, all you did was show me how little I actually mattered to you. She flinched, tears welling up in her eyes again. That's not true, John. You mattered. You still matter. I shook my head, my voice cold. If I mattered, you wouldn't have gone to that hotel. You wouldn't have lied to my face and expected me to just be okay with it. You wanted your cake, and you wanted to eat it too. But life doesn't work that way. Linda bit her lip, wiping away a tear that rolled down her cheek. I know I messed up. I know I ruined everything. But I'm asking you, please, can't we just try again? Can't we rebuild? I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Rebuild? After everything? There's no rebuilding, Linda. You wrecked everything beyond repair, I said firmly. You made your choice. You chose Frank. You chose this affair. And now you're going to have to live with the consequences. She didn't say anything for a while, just stared down at her hands, probably realizing that this was it. There was no going back. I'll never forgive myself, she whispered. I know you won't either, but I can't live with the idea of losing you completely. You lost me the moment you decided you could love two people, I said flatly. The moment you chose Frank, you lost me. I don't belong to you anymore. I never will again. She broke down at that, sobbing quietly into her hands. Part of me almost felt sorry for her, seeing her like this, so broken, so desperate. But I reminded myself of what she'd done, of the nights I'd stayed up, wondering if I was going crazy for even trusting her in the first place. I stood up, feeling nothing but a cold emptiness. Goodbye, Linda. She looked up, tears streaming down her face. John, please. But I didn't wait to hear the rest. I turned and walked away, leaving her sitting there on the bench, crying into her hands. That was the last time I saw Linda before the divorce was finalized. There were no more desperate texts or calls after that. She must have finally understood that it was over, that there was no going back. And I felt relief. After walking away from Linda in the park, I knew that was the real end. She didn't call or text after that. I think she finally realized there was nothing left to save. The divorce was moving ahead, and I could feel the weight of everything lifting off my shoulders. The next few weeks passed in a blur of legal meetings and paperwork. Linda tried to negotiate, but I stayed firm. There was no way she was going to walk away with half of everything after what she did. I had the evidence, the hotel footage, and all the texts to back me up. She knew she couldn't fight it. As for Frank, word got around that he'd lost his job. Apparently, the footage I sent to his boss made its way through the office, and soon enough, HR had no choice but to cut him loose. I heard through the grapevine that his wife, Beth, had filed for divorce too. So in the end, both Linda and Frank got exactly what they deserved, each other and nothing else. I signed the final divorce papers without a second thought. No hesitation, no regret. Linda was officially out of my life, and I was free to start over. It wasn't easy, even after everything. There were moments when the loneliness crept in. I'd spent years building a life with her, and now it was gone. But I wasn't looking back. I couldn't. The chapter with Linda was closed, and I was ready to turn the page. After the divorce was finalized, life felt strangely quiet. No more Linda, no more drama, just me, the house, and the kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. But even with that relief, the silence was heavy at times. It wasn't that I missed her, but I missed the life we'd built. All those years, the routines, the shared moments, they were just gone, destroyed by her selfishness. It felt like I was standing in the ruins of what used to be my life, trying to figure out what came next. To move forward, I started going out more, reconnecting with old friends, throwing myself into hobbies I'd let slip. I even joined a gym, something I'd put off for too long. It felt good to reclaim parts of my life that had been buried under the weight of Linda's betrayal. Slowly, I started feeling like myself again. I wasn't John, the guy with the cheating wife. I was just John. Now and then, I'd hear about Linda and Frank. They tried to make a go of it after everything, but it didn't last. Apparently, without the excitement of sneaking around, their relationship fell apart. Frank moved out of state, probably trying to escape the mess he helped create. Linda was left trying to pick up the pieces of her life, but that wasn't my concern anymore. She had made her choice, and now she had to live with it. For me, the divorce wasn't just about legal freedom, it was about getting my life back. I wasn't the fool she thought I was, the guy she could walk all over. I walked away with my dignity, my future still intact, and without any lingering bitterness. I didn't know exactly what the future held, but for the first time in a long while it was mine to build on my terms. And that felt pretty damn good. It's been a few months now and life's starting to feel normal again, my new normal anyway. The divorce is behind me, and I've settled into a routine that's all mine. No Linda, no drama, just me figuring out what's next. It's not easy starting over, but there's something refreshing about having a clean slate. I'm in control of my life again. I don't really think about Linda much anymore. Every once in a while, her name comes up in conversations with mutual friends, but it's always brief. I heard she moved out of town, trying to start fresh somewhere else, But honestly, I don't care. She made her choices, and now she's dealing with the consequences. Frank is long gone, too. He's probably licking his wounds somewhere far away, pretending none of this ever happened. As for me, I've changed. I'm not the same guy who let things slide, who ignored red flags for the sake of keeping the peace. I'm smarter now, wiser, and yet maybe a little more guarded, but I'm okay with that. It's part of the process. I'm looking ahead now, thinking about the things I want to do, the places I want to go. I've reconnected with people who actually matter, people who've had my back through all this. I'm even thinking about dating again, taking it slow this time, making sure I don't end up with someone like Linda. What happened with her and Frank was brutal, no doubt. But in a way, it taught me what I'm made of. I walked through the fire and came out stronger on the other side. And now, as I stand here with my future wide open, I realize something. I'm free. And I'm finally ready to move on.